Okay, so I think that we are now live.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, great. So thanks, guys, for coming to this presuppositionalism panel hangout. So we've got me, Alex Malpass, joined tonight by Ozzy, Matt Dilahunty, Floyd FP, and Dan Linford. So we've got some interesting people here to give their perspectives and their thoughts on presuppositionalism. So I guess we're all not exactly favourable towards the position, so it's going to be somewhat of a one-sided slagging match or something, but hopefully we'll get some kind of good, interesting perspectives and maybe some something that's worth watching for people who are interested in this on both sides. So I think maybe we'll just begin. I'll just say a little bit about who I am. I mean, I have a background in philosophy. I've recently had an engagement with Matt Slick, who I think we're in agreement is a presuppositionalist, regardless of what he says. So that counts as engaging with the presup, and I've written some blog posts on this subject, spilling out my thoughts about it. So yeah, Ozzy, do you want to just give us a quick kind of bio?
Yeah, sure. My name is Ozymandias Ramses II. I'm a YouTuber, and I'm on Google Plus and on Facebook. My background is also in philosophy. I don't have a doctorate in philosophy, but I did pursue philosophy as a career for a time. And my specialty was in contemporary analytic epistemology. And I was a fundamentalist in my adolescence. I sort of shook off my faith early on, and so I've had a lifelong interest in the philosophy of religion and apologetics and counter-apologetics, although I didn't pursue it academically. And when I left academia, I started participating in online fora and discussions about religious apologetics. And that's where I met Floyd, actually, was on IRC, and that's where I first encountered presuppositionalism. I had read a little bit about it when I was in university as a grad student, as a teaching assistant for philosophy of religion, but I had never actually met anyone who espoused presuppositional apologetics, and so Floyd FP and I used to be embroiled in lengthy text debates on IRC with a number of presuppositionalists. And the presuppositionalism that I was familiar with was sort of more academically based. Prior to that, it was the works of Greg Bahnsen, Von Til, that sort of stuff. And then, but online, what I was encountering was what's sometimes disparagingly called the cyclone variety, the version of presuppositionalism espoused and promulgated by Saiten Bruggencate. And so that was a kind of interesting challenge. And so that's my background and my exposure to it. And then so when I joined YouTube, I started creating some videos specifically to address this kind of apologetic and what I see is wrong with it.
Okay, good. Thanks very much. So I guess everyone here probably knows Matt already, but if you want to just give a quick bio of yourself, Matt.
Sure. I'm Matt Dilahunty. I host the Atheist Experience TV show, and I do debates. I don't have any formal training in squat, so I have no actual expertise relevant to this. As a matter of fact, when I did the debate with Cy, I think in the few days leading up to it, Ozzy and I had more conversations with Ozzy than probably anybody else in my life at that moment. And part of it was because I, being self-taught, had a couple of potentially flawed or ill-formed or not very accurately described views about things that I needed to distill down. And Ozzy was a big help there, even though, I don't know, we might still subtly disagree on stuff. Who knows? We'll find out. But it kind of started with Matt Slick calling into the show a number of years ago. And when I was a Christian, I was an evidentialist. I mean, I was familiar, at least passingly, with Van Til and Clark and others, but I don't know that I would have identified as somebody who just took it as a presupposition. It was the whole world screamed out, the truth of God, and it wasn't necessarily about reason. So I'm really interested to kind of hear what everybody else has to say, get some corrections, learn something new, maybe teach somebody else. But yeah, I think this will be a little one-sided, and I'm sure that at least, well, some of you will hear from Cy. I won't, because I've had him blocked on every form of media since before the debate we had. So.
Okay, great. So thanks for that. Floyd, do you want to just give us a quick bio as well? Thanks.
Sure, I'm Floyd FP. I'm a YouTube slash Google Plus participant in the Great Debate community. I've been involved in kind of biblical studies and criticism for, I don't know, many years. First as a Christian and then as a former Christian, and I enjoy counter apologetics. As Ozzy mentioned, I first came across presuppositional apologetics on IRC chat. In fact, I remember, I think the first time I came across Ozzy, the first thing I asked him, I said, Ozzy, did you ever hear of presuppositionalism? Because when I first came across the argument, I was ready to debate what I was used to, which was evidentialism apologetics, and a presupper hit me with the typical presup argument, and it was my first experience with it was kind of like when you first hear the ontological argument for God. You know, it sure sounds like bullshit, but you just can't articulate what the problem is with it. So until you actually study epistemology and get a little bit into philosophy, you're going to kind of struggle with it. So thanks to my research and guys like Ozzy, I think I'm well versed in it right now.
Good, thanks. Last but not least, Dan, do you want to give us a quick bio?
Yeah. So I'm Dan Linford. You can find me either on the Patheos Network. I blog for a blog called The Secular Spectrum. You can also find me at danlinford.wordpress.com. I'm an instructor at Christopher Newport University here in Virginia, and I am an adjunct professor at Thomas Nelson Community College, and I'm now a PhD student at Purdue University. And I have a fairly lengthy and extensively researched paper currently under review on presuppositionalism. I also have a small interaction on my blog with Saitan Bruggencate.
Good. Okay. So I mean, it would be a good place to start if you wanted to like run through the argument that's in your paper that's under review, because this would be a genuine peer-reviewed paper.
Right. So I think actually a better place to start is to start just by laying out what presuppositionalism is for those of our viewers who don't have any background, don't know at all what we're talking about. So it might be good to sort of lay out this distinction between really three kinds of positions: fideism, evidentialism, and presuppositionalism. And really, presuppositionalism historically comes from trying to find a way to argue for Christianity that is neither fideism nor evidentialism. So fideism is the view that we come to truths about religion or about God or about Christianity by way of faith. So the fideist, they might take the position that there is there's a religious experience, and so it's not really an argument that has to be articulated, but rather some kind of experience, or perhaps it's that there's various kinds of things that have been revealed to humankind, but in any case, one is supposed to put one's trust completely into God, to the extent that it wouldn't make sense to even deliver an argument for God's existence. So famously, someone like Kierkegaard delivers a fideist response, or someone like Pierre Bayle is another famous fideist. On the other hand, there's evidentialists. And evidentialists are the folks that, at least often these days, you'll hear them in Christian apologetic circles, right? So William Lane Craig is an example of an evidentialist. He takes the position that there are going to be these arguments that you can deliver on the basis of empirical evidence for God's existence. So you might point out that there is fine-tuning in the various constants that are used in physics, and so the idea there is supposed to be that there's this mind of some sort outside of the universe that sets the constants that we use in physics, or that sets the physical laws, or it might be some argument from cosmology, where what's called the cosmological argument, where the very existence of the universe itself is somehow empirical evidence for God's existence. Or maybe it's that various observations about morality are evidence for God's existence. That's what the evidentialist claims. Presuppositionalism is an attempt to abandon either of those two. They want to abandon evidentialism because evidentialism requires you to look to yourself first, right? It's that you're going to weigh evidence either way, and that to the presuppositionalism looks like a kind of idolatry because you're putting yourself before God in terms of your epistemology, in terms of how you know things about the world. They don't like fideism either because fideism seems to divorce Christianity from reason altogether, and that to many people seems like an odd thing to do. Many atheists in the audience might think that that's an odd thing to do, to divorce one's religious beliefs from reason. But a lot of atheists are going to want to say that we should turn to reason when we evaluate our beliefs. Whereas the presuppositionalism, trying to cut a balance between these two, wants to say they aim to say the following. They try to say that the precondition for the possibility of having knowledge at all, or about learning about the world, or by the precondition for using reason, that what enables us to do any of those things, to have those kinds of capacities, is that we first presuppose Christian theism. And importantly, they will point out that, well, there's lots of people who claim that they aren't Christian theists, but on the presuppositionalist view, what those people are really doing is that they're in self-denial. They really secretly, deep inside of themselves, even perhaps unknown to themselves, really are Christian theists, but yet they will deny it because they are perhaps angry at God or something like this. There's like a kind of self-denial there. You might imagine in other contexts someone who they make racist proclamations in public, but when you ask them, are you a racist? They say, no, racism is bad, and so on. That's a kind of self-denial in another place. And the presuppositionalist makes the claim that similarly the non-Christian is in self-denial, is self-deluded about whether or not they really believe in God. And what they'll try to point out as well, the atheist or the non-Christian, they use reason just like anybody else, and what has to enable that, according to the presuppositionalist, is that they have first presupposed the Christian God, even though they, of course, deny that they have presupposed the Christian God.
Good, excellent. So maybe I missed it in your summary then, but are you placing those like rationalistic arguments, like the ontological argument or the first mover argument or something? You're lumping them in with the evidentialists. I maybe would have described that as a classical apologetics rather than all of it being just evidentialist, fideism, and presuppositionalist. Surely that Aquinas-style rationalistic proof isn't really evidentialist.
Right. Yeah. So that's right. No, that's right. That's a further complication here, and you're absolutely right though that really there's really two kinds of positions that one can take other than presuppositionalism or fideism. That there's evidentialism on the one hand and rationalism on the other. And rationalism is the attempt to start from some sort of self-evident principles and then proceed through some chain of deductive reasoning to God's existence. And it's true that in the apologetics literature they call that classical apologetics, though in the philosophy of religion literature you won't see that phrase as often.
So maybe it's like a spectrum where on the one hand you've got the fideist who says that there's nothing that you can say to prove God, or nothing needs to be said, and the evidentialist, rationalist, whatever, is in the middle saying there's something, you point to either the complexity of the eye or something, or you point to some kind of rationalistic proof. And then on the far scale, you've got the presuppositionalist who says something like anything you say is proof of God. So you can kind of see there's a sliding scale between them. Okay. All right, good. So we've got figures like Cornelius Van Til, who I guess is like the figurehead of the presuppositionalist movement, although I'm not sure that it's fair to say that it originates entirely with him. I think that the roots of it go back slightly further, but generally speaking, these guys on the internet guys who talk about presuppositionalism these days all name drop Cornelius Van Til as their
Van Til draws a number of sources, right? I mean, no philosopher's working in a vacuum. But Van Til himself, really what we now call presuppositionalism begins with Van Til. He draws the transcendental argument for God's existence from a fairly obscure paper of Immanuel Kant. Various other aspects of what he says come from John Calvin or from Augustine or from the Bible. But really, Van Til is the person who drew on all those things and then combined them together into a kind of coherent theology. But yeah, I mean, there's a distinction between what comes before Van Til. There's also a distinction between what Van Til says and what comes after, and especially between what folks like Van Til students like Greg Bahnsen and John Frame, and then with this internet community of presuppositionalists, say, like people like Seiton Bruggencate or Matt Slick, the folks who you see now on the internet, you'll sometimes even see them saying things that someone like Van Til would have outright rejected.
Right. Well, my understanding is Van Til didn't like the label presuppositionalism anyway. I think, and personally, if I just kind of put myself in his shoes, I think he was smart enough, he understood the subject well enough, that he probably intuited that the label exposed part of the problem, that he didn't want to necessarily have to say this was a presupposition. And I just find it strange that, when you have this history of people like, Van Til and others, of course, he died back when I was in high school or whatever. It's weird that we live in a world where the primary individuals putting forth this particular apologetics consist of one person who clearly doesn't understand it and couldn't argue his way out of a paper bag. He's just regurgitating this stuff to the best of his ability, which I can't fault him for because I do it too. And another one who flatly denies that Matt Slick flatly denies that he's a presuppositionalist. So maybe it's the case that Matt is far closer to Van Til than Cy is, and just isn't aware of why he denies it.
Right. So you'll hear many presuppositionalists, or people who we've been calling presuppositionalists or whatever, you hear a lot of them say that they'll deny the label presuppositionalism. I don't think it's necessarily because they don't want presuppositions in their system. It's very important for the transcendental argument that you're talking about, the preconditions that enable something like knowledge in the first place, and you might call those presuppositions. What they want to deny is that they have created a new theology distinct from what it says in the Bible. So you'll often hear them say that what they're advancing is a biblical epistemology. Now, as a matter of just looking at historical documents and so forth, that it's not obvious to me that you'll find anything like presuppositionalism in the Bible unless you're already motivated to find it there. But of course, they will claim, and they will draw on all sorts of biblical verses to support themselves that you can find it in the Bible.
So it's primarily in Acts, I think, where Paul is in Athens talking to the philosophers. Is that right? I mean, I'm no biblical scholar, but maybe someone can fill us in on that passage or how they relate, or how they extract presuppositionalism from that part.
Well, I don't remember how they extracted from that part in particular, but I mean, there's a number of places where that they could cite. Well, first of all, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There isn't a proof of God anywhere in there, right? There isn't an argument in support of God's existence, right? It just starts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. There it is. It is presupposed. It is assumed in the very first sentence of the Holy Book that God exists. And so, I mean, I think that they're on some theological and scriptural grounds there, traditional theological grounds there. You know, honestly, I think that this epistemology is not something that people had in mind in antiquity. I don't think the earliest Christians thought in these terms at all. But certainly they did presuppose that there was a God. I mean, I think most people in antiquity just didn't even doubt that there was a God, right? There just weren't enough atheists running around for people to have bothered much with having to argue for God's existence, right? Certainly the average person didn't have to do it. And I don't think Paul had to worry too much about it. He was living in the Greco-Roman world. He was surrounded by Jews and pagans. Everyone seemed to think that there was at least one God. So I don't think he was worried about arguing for the existence of a God. He was trying to argue for the existence of this particular God.
If everybody around you believes in a God, well, the common top-level theistic debates that I constantly find myself in now, which is frustrating that somebody who is a committed Christian comes to a debate with, you know, the cosmological argument or some version of a cosmological argument, arguing for this vague deism rather than what they believe. But if you live in a world where everybody believes in a God, then your apologetics are about convincing them of either why your God is the one true God or why your God is better than their gods. And I'm actually, for the Atheist Debates Project right now, I'm working on a video about this, and this isn't merely tied to presuppositionalism, but it does happen. It happens with Psy and others. This label of professed atheist that they're getting in part from Romans chapter 1, where it basically says that God has written the truth of the universe and all the evidence of things that he's created are written in your heart, so they are without excuse, and that's a paraphrase, not a quote, as I recently bashed somebody for adding their own words to the Bible. But they get this idea that it says right there in the Bible. We'll set aside whether or not we should pay any attention to what it says in the Bible, but it says right there, God has made it obvious, and so all of you who don't believe are, you know, either engaged in some sort of self-deception or delusion or dishonesty because you in fact do know. And so actually part of the video is going to be disconnecting or exposing this disconnect between knowledge and belief, to claim that we know that God exists, but we, you know, don't believe it or profess not to believe it.
Yeah, I've heard presuppositionalists say. I've heard presuppositionists say as well that their approach to apologetics is more biblical because they feel they're more loyal to Christianity than the evidentialists. Or the evidentialists might consider, oh well, I could be wrong, but look at all this evidence that points to my, you know, to my belief. Where a presuppositionist will say he will not question the Bible at all. He will take it as an axiom. You should never question it. It's the truth, and as Matt said, everyone knows it's true, so there's no need to argue it. And they're just going to preach basically what it says. I've seen presuppositionalists, when they're on a roll, they'll just simply recite Bible verses, saying, "Well, here's the account. The Bible says this. You know, God created everything. God created logic. God created morality. Everything. You know, the Bible says it all. So all I need to do is basically hit you over the head with Bible verses because you know it's true."
I think we have to draw a line, though. It seems pretty clear, at least to me, that there are at least two different categories that get labeled as presuppositional. The one from Van Til and others, where we have sort of the transcendental argument for the existence of God, where we're basically trying to justify a foundation for reason and reasoning, or claim that God is the only pathway to that. Then there's a second category of presuppositionalism, which I believe is Clark.
Yeah, Clarkian scripturalism.
Yeah, where it's just we're going to de facto accept that the Bible is literal and true. I don't know that that's as popular, because even that Pastor Greg Locke, whoever was putting the challenge out to atheists who were holding up his King James and announced the exact number of words, and every one of them comes literally from God. He's not in any way trying to justify that. He's offering that as his presupposition, and yet when you get him in conversation, as David Smalley did, right off the bat he starts saying, well, maybe there's this and maybe this. So it's not necessarily a literal. But yeah, two different presuppositional, and I think that from the path from Van Til down to the wannabe wish I was Van Tils of Psy and Slick and others, I think that's the one I tend to focus on. The idea that we're just going to de facto accept the Bible, I think I'd just go with Hitchens and acknowledging that which can be asserted without evidence can be rejected without
Right. Well, this is why, Van Til would have rejected that outright, because for Van Til, again, fideism is bad. On Van Til's view, to just accept these things on faith is wrong-headed. So the idea that you would start with Scripture, not because it was a necessary precondition for reasoning in the first place, and not because it was not because of some other argument, but because one simply placed one's trust in Scripture. That would be to just outright reject everything that Van Til believed in and argued for.
Yeah, and I think that as a tactic with arguing with people who are disagreeing with you, the force of saying, well, I just take my starting point to be that the Bible is true, is that it persuades almost nobody. That's like, you just do what Matt did and just say, well, all right, then, well, I just don't, and then we're at some kind of impasse, and they're like, why start where you start, why start where I start? It seems that you can't just pick a starting point arbitrarily. But the selling point for the Van Tilian approach, it seems to me, is if someone's trying to say to you, look, your holy book has these like weird contradictory bits in it, or it seems like there's no archaeological evidence for these claims that it makes, that there's supposed to be some kind of Copernican shift where you can push the burden of proof back onto the person who's just made those claims at you by saying, well, how do you even make a claim? What do you even mean by saying something like it's true that there's contradictions, or that it's true that there's no archaeological evidence? Like, you have to justify that you can actually make that type of statement in the first place. And so it seems to me it's a kind of sophisticated burden shifting technique to sort of like, rather than dealing with the detail that you've just brought up and being on the back foot, they've put you on the back foot, having to sort of come up with some theory of truth or theory of values or something much more difficult to do unless you've spent a long time studying philosophy. It's the sort of thing that's most people, it's like throwing them a curveball that they don't know how to answer. It seems to me that that's why it's popular on the internet. You can say a lot of like complicated sounding stuff that will shut people up who know loads about biblical contradictions or other these well-known kind of criticisms of Christianity.
And if you watch lectures in which presuppositionalist figures teach other members of other Christians how to do the presuppositionalist apologetic, one of the things that they'll say is that the whole point is to silence the nonsense of the non-believer, or something like that. I got to
shut the mouth of the unbeliever.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So there's this sort of a very different role that the arguments have than when we normally offer, or when other sorts of folks like you or I offer arguments in the public sphere. That when I present arguments to others, part of it is to try to convince them that I'm right, but then another part is to sort of see, well, am I right about what I'm saying? And then there's sort of a third component that's, can we work together to figure out what the truth actually is? Whereas the presuppositionalist, often the ones that you'll find on the internet, they're already convinced that they're right, and that the non-believer comes from a point of being sort of deluded and having their minds darkened by sin, so they can't see the truth, and that what really needs to happen for them is that they need to have this sort of inner awakening, so that it's made apparent to them what they secretly already believe to be the case.
Yeah, well, there's an internal logic there. If you posit that a person's mind has been clouded by sin, by their sinful nature, and that is what is preventing them from accepting the truth of the religion, And by the way, I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to embrace presuppositionalism. I once saw a hilarious debate between a Muslim presuppositionalist and a Christian presuppositionalist. And it was hilarious. They just went back and forth, and unfortunately that video got taken down, and I didn't have the foresight to download it, because it was sort of a hilarious exercise. Two people with completely different theologies, positing different gods, applying the same apologetic against one another, and alleging that the other person was not entitled to use reason. It was really quite hilarious. But anyway, there is an internal logic to this. If you do in fact posit that your opponent's mind is in a condition that they cannot apprehend the argument that you're putting forth, then it makes a certain kind of sense to say, well, look, I'm not going to bother trying to persuade you, because under your present condition, you are unpersuadable, right? There's no hope. So I'm not going to bother trying to persuade you. Look, you already know the truth. You're just in denial about it, right? And you're denying it in your unrighteousness. So that, I think, there's a certain internal consistency there that I don't fault for them. If that's their view, then that's their view. That is at least internally consistent. And maybe that we should say something a little bit about the role of consistency, because the one thing that I've noticed about presuppositionalists is they place a lot of value on the concept of consistency. They think that, look, I have my worldview, I have my belief set, and you have your belief set, and they seem to view these as like they're snow globes. They're hermetically sealed. I'm in my worldview, you're in your worldview. And their insistence is that within their own worldview, within their own hermetically sealed bubble of beliefs, they have the conceptual resources, they insist, to account for things like logic and truth and beauty and values and morality and so forth, and that you do not. You know, if you don't posit a God, they say, and specifically if you don't posit their God, whether it's the Muslim God or the Christian God, whatever God they think you need to posit, if you don't posit that God, then you lack the conditions necessary to make sense of things like logic, truth, beauty, value, morality, and so forth. And because you are living exactly as if, taking for granted things like, knowledge, truth, beauty, values, morality, then you are really living on borrowed capital. You're living in bad faith. Your worldview, your belief set, simply cannot account for that which you take for granted. Right? There is an incoherence in your worldview. There's if it's not incoherent, at the very least, it is inadequate. There's something inadequate about your belief set, because it doesn't have within it the conceptual resources necessary for these conditions of intelligibility. And a mistake that they make is they think that if they can demonstrate that person X or Y or Z cannot account for this, that, or the other thing, that therefore that demonstrates that their worldview is false. And that does not follow. The fact that you can't account for something doesn't show that everything else in your belief set is false and that it needs to be jettisoned. And much less does it show that one's own belief set is correct, because they could have it wrong too, right? But they have this idea of sort of that if I can demonstrate that there's an inadequacy or an inconsistency in your worldview, that therefore mine is correct because I have claimed that mine can account for these things. Even if you could account for these things, and I have to say these accounts are rather thin. They have a tendency to be of the God did it flavor. But even if they could account for the things that they say that they could account for using their God, they haven't established that it's the right account. Right? The fact that you have an account doesn't mean that it's the right account. Right? So they stake a lot on this concept of consistency, as if consistency means truth. Look, if there's an inconsistency in your belief set, then that means something is wrong in your belief set. It doesn't mean your whole belief set is junk and that you jettison your whole map just because there's an error on your map. And if another person has a consistent map, it doesn't mean that the map actually represents the territory. The map can be perfectly consistent. There's nothing wonky about the map. It just doesn't match the territory. And this is a mistake I hear all the time.
Yeah, so they have this view that we accept or reject worldviews wholesale. But if you look at at actual knowledge forming processes, that's not typically the way that we form our beliefs, right? So what we normally do is we form our beliefs piecemeal. If you look at the way that, for instance, scientists evaluate theories, you don't reject all of science and then replace it with an entirely new science. No, what you do is you have various theories about various phenomena. and then those theories relate to each other in some complicated way, but the rejection of one particular theory, so for instance the rejection of Newtonian physics and its replacement by general relativity and quantum mechanics, and well, by relativity more generally, and by quantum mechanics, it doesn't come at the cost of rejecting various biological theories, right? There's some degree of independence between the various beliefs that we have in our big web of beliefs, of all the beliefs that we hold, so that we're able to evaluate beliefs in this piecemeal way. But I think one of the important things to understand here about presuppositionalism is it's a doctrine that's very important to them, that they call the impossibility of the contrary. And it's this view that the only worldview that is internally consistent, that doesn't lead to contradictions, is the presuppositionalist worldview, the Christian, what they understand to be the Christian worldview. So that if you adopt any other worldview whatsoever, it will always lead you into contradictions at some point or another. And that's how they're able to do that. But notice, they never actually offer an argument. Not even Van Til offers an argument for the impossibility of the contrary, other than by appealing to his theology. So one way that you might think that someone could argue this is just to take all possible non-Christian worldviews and then show deductively that they lead to contradictions. No one bothers to do that. Instead, what they do is they try to, what sophisticated presuppositionalists will do if they address this issue at all, is they will try to show that Christian theism leads to the conclusion that a non-Christian worldview will be contradictory. Yeah.
This is actually, so this is a point that I got from Ozzy, and why I was so happy that he was here as well. And he summed it up nicely when he was trying to explain something to me, that the two key flaws here are, number one, they are claiming that their worldview can account for something, and they are claiming that no other worldview can, and they are doing nothing to demonstrate either of those two propositions. And they have to demonstrate both of those in order to make their case. This is why you hear things like, you're borrowing from our worldview. I like his snow globe example as well. I worked on an outline for a borrowing from worldview video, and the key is that this view that I have to borrow from their worldview is something that I could say to them as well. I could say, well, no, you're borrowing from my worldview, and then we get nowhere. And the key would be to recognize that, in fact, our worldviews overlap, which is exactly what we would expect as, beings in a similar universe with similar experiences trying to explain the same things. Of course we're going to have things that overlap. And they use this tactic not just within, arguing with regard to presuppositionalism, but also in opposition to evolution. Their whole target is to say, well, evolution can't account for X. It can't account for the origin of life. And they view this as a failing of this particular model. And even now, I saw a news article yesterday about the LHC has discovered some wonky behavior of leptons that would go against the standard model. And I could just immediately in my head picture a Christian apologist arguing that, well, the standard model can't explain this. And then you get right back down to, we've got another assertion that's neither testable nor falsifiable and could be thrown right back in your face.
I find it interesting that they approach worldviews as totally separate from each other, because I think, I've heard quite a few presuppositionalists say, oh, you presuppose atheism, or you presuppose naturalism or physicalism. Mm-hmm. As I try to explain them, no, I don't presuppose those things. That's a conclusion I arrived at. No, I accept I have presuppositions, but I didn't start with the presupposition that naturalism is true. And it seems like they're kind of projecting onto us what they've done themselves. They take on their whole religion as a package deal. They take on the whole set of their religious doctrines as one big package, and then they project it as, oh, that's how other people must take on their worldviews at all. Where no, we learn a little bit at a time over years.
So Ozzy had something he wanted to say about the impossibility of the contrary.
Oh yeah. One thing I've been hearing just in the last year, I mean, I've heard it said before, but in the last year I've heard it said quite a lot from would-be presuppositional apologists. So they'll say that, I know that God exists necessarily because of the impossibility of the contrary. Now, there's one sense in which that makes sense, and there's one sense in which that's nonsense. The sense in which it's nonsense is this: to say that something is necessary because of the impossibility of the contrary is tautology. It's the redundancy. Something is logically necessary if and only if the contrary is an impossibility. That's what it means. That's what we mean by logical necessity. Something is logically necessary when the contrary is impossible. So when they say, I know that God exists necessarily because of the impossibility of the contrary, they're not actually saying anything there. They're just saying, I know that God is necessary because God is necessary, by which I mean that the contrary is impossible. But they could mean, the sense in which it would make sense is if they said, I have an argument that would demonstrate the impossibility of the contrary, right? And that is how I know it's necessary. Okay, that would be great, right? Then it would not be sort of a redundancy that they were uttering. It would be meaningful.
We can really distinguish between several different senses of possibility and impossibility. This takes us rather far afield in some very technical issues, but to sort of simplify matters, see, most Christians are fine saying the following. They're fine saying, or most theists in general, are fine saying that God is metaphysically the most ultimate thing. But not epistemologically. Epistemologically, we're stuck beginning with ourselves, right? So Descartes, for instance, says that Descartes begins his meditations by trying to find some proposition that he cannot possibly doubt, and what he comes to the conclusion of is that what he finds is that there is a proposition he can't doubt, and that's the existence of his own person. So he has to begin with himself, and then he can reason to God and to everything else. Presuppositionalists, they reject that, right? So they think that God is not only metaphysically ultimate, but also epistemically ultimate, that your knowledge is going to somehow begin not with yourself, but with God. Because to begin with yourself is idolatrous, to begin with God is somehow the proper way to glorify God, and so on. Well, this is to say that God is not just necessary in the metaphysical sense, that any metaphysically possible world will have God in it, but also epistemically necessary. That no matter how you reason, you have to have God in the picture. And so there's two different, philosophers call these modal claims, right? There's two different modal claims at work there, two different ways in which the contrary is impossible. So other Christians might say, Plantinga, for instance, Alban Plantinga might say that that God's non-existence is metaphysically impossible, but not epistemically impossible. Whereas the presuppositionalist will say that God's non-existence is both metaphysically and epistemically impossible.
But I've always found that claim very, extraordinarily implausible. I mean, isn't it just? I mean, that's not much of an objection on its own, just to say that. But I mean, well, I suppose I can foresee what the reply to this is. But that isn't just the presence of someone who reasons but doesn't believe in God a counterexample to the idea that you can't reason unless you believe in God. Like, Bertrand Russell, for instance, clearly reasoned, right? Didn't believe in God. So
but the presuppositionalist is going to.
It's not belief in God that they're saying is the foundation of reason. It is God. So you can reason, and the reason that you can reason is because there's a God who serves as a foundation.
Well, but that's not quite right. The presuppositionalist is not going to say that exactly. They're going to say something. So that someone like Thomas Aquinas would say that what enables reason in the first place is God's existence, because God is metaphysically the source of everything else that is, and without God's existence, there wouldn't be anything else. But the presuppositionalist takes us a step further, because the presuppositionalist says it's not just that there wouldn't be anything else, but that you have to acknowledge God's existence in order to have reason and knowledge. And so on.
Right. So the comeback from the presuppositionalist is to say, well, you do believe in God. That's how you can reason. It's because secretly you're in bad faith and you've got this suppressed belief in God that enables you to get going in the first place. And part of the problem with that, of course, is that anyone can throw the accusation that you're repressing something around without any, because these are what Popper would have called like a pseudo-scientific, unfalsifiable thing.
Yeah.
If I just say to you, you're repressed about sexual feelings for your mother, and you say, no, I'm not, then I say, exactly. You've just proved that you are by denying that you are. And if you agree that you are, then I charge you for the hour of successful therapy or something. Right? That's the kind of Popperian claim that's what's wrong with just saying that someone's in denial about something. It just seems to me exactly what the presuppositionalist is doing here. There's a really cheap move to justify.
We have some objections from Ozzy and Floyd to Alex.
I was going to object to what Dan said, but I think I'm going to place my money on Ozzy addressing it or Floyd addressing it.
Okay. Well, Matt, you had something you want to say about the Descartes' cogito argument. I'm not going to be addressing that, so you're free to address that after if you wish. Alex, maybe you misspoke, or maybe we just in fact disagree on this. But the presuppositionalists that I've read, people like Greg Bahnsen and Van Til, don't argue that you have to believe in God in order to be in possession of knowledge. You don't have to believe in God. There just has to be a God. God's existence is a precondition of knowledge. God created, he didn't just create the world, but he created the world for us. And he created us in the world. And he created a world where there are, in fact, going to be stable regularities and uniformities in nature. He created us with sensory systems that are, in fact, going to be reliable. And consequently, we can trust our memory and our visual sensory capacities and our inferential practices and stuff like that, because they were all created for this world, and this world for us, for that. This world was created for us, and us for the world. Consequently, our mental experiences that we have, although they are not perfect, right? There's no certainty involved, right? But we can have this sort of middle knowledge, right, where our visual experiences and our mental experiences, and generally systematically covary with changing states of affairs around us, so that we are in fact representing reality quite reliably, although imperfectly. And there can be cases of.
I mean, that's not the way that I've read Van Til. I mean,
just let me finish the point, if I may. Sure. So I'm taking this mostly from Bahnsen, actually, but I remember reading something in Van Til about this. In fact, I remember doing a hangout where we talked a bit about it, but where God, because he exists and created the world thus and so, has created a set of objective conditions that make knowledge possible even for a non-believer. Even an unbeliever, though he is unable to justify his beliefs, is still in a position to know things, right? So they will not say that they don't have to. A presuppositionalist doesn't have to argue you can't know anything. He can only say you're not in a position to justify what you know.
But what you're doing there is saying that God's existence, metaphysical existence of God, is a precondition for the possibility of knowledge, which is fine. I mean, and that's a separate claim that I wasn't trying to offer a defeat at all. What I was trying to do is offer what Dan was saying a moment ago, is that the distinctive presuppositionalist claim is that God is not just metaphysically necessary, like in a kind of Thomas Aquinas sense, but that God is epistemically necessary. So it's necessary to believe in God in order to do any reasoning. And I was just saying that if you surely the existence of people like Bertrand Russell is a defeater to that claim, isn't it just obviously false for that reason? I mean,
yeah, there's countless defeaters to that. And I was actually, and I'm not picking on Dan, I was surprised to hear this because it doesn't match up with anything that I'm familiar with, anything that has actually been argued to me, and the reason for that is they're using God as the foundation for as a foundation for the reliability of reason, not as the foundation for any individual's ability to reason, and not that belief in God. Just like if I happen to use a calculator, I can get the right answer even if I don't know how the calculator works. No individual their ability to reason isn't contingent upon God, because even a presuppositionalist would acknowledge that there are people who believe in God who don't consistently reason.
Well, they would say that that person claims to believe in God, but that that they're actually suppressing the truth that they know within their deepest selves, right? So I believe it's...
They claim to believe in God. What truth are they suppressing? The truth that God doesn't exist?
Well, they claim to... oh, no, I'm sorry, I must have misspoken. That their claim about the atheist is that the atheist is suppressing their inner knowledge that...
So presuppositionalists would acknowledge that not everyone who believes in God is able to consistently rely...
Well, but hang on. But the presuppositionalist claims that there is no one who doesn't actually believe in God, right? They claim that there's only people who self-identify as atheists,
sure,
but they're not actually atheists.
But they're not necessarily claiming that belief in God is a foundation upon so acceptance that there is a God is how you can know or how you can affirm that reason is reliable. But the existence of is why reason is reliable, and that's
we can reason, but we're not acknowledging it. It's like we're biting the hand that feeds you, so to speak.
So this is there's a technical name for the doctrine that I'm talking about. It's called epistemic aseity. So ordinarily, when theologians talk about aseity, what they mean is that God is the most ultimate thing. And usually this is meant in a metaphysical sense, that God is the thing that grounds the explanation for everything else. But what the presuppositionalist has in their picture, in addition to metaphysical aseity, is epistemic aseity. That God is epistemically the most ultimate thing. And that's the thing that's, I believe it's John Frame who actually uses that terminology, but that's the thing that is one of the things that's sort of unique about their picture that distinguishes it from that of other Christians, right? So a parallel kind of argument that is sometimes offered is the moral argument. So ordinarily when the moral argument is offered, the idea is that everyone can reason about morality, everyone can recognize morality. That's actually really important for the moral argument, or else it starts from question-begging premises. But what the conclusion is supposed to be is that because we all recognize moral facts, that therefore God exists because that's the only explanation of moral facts. You could imagine someone who sort of does like faux presuppositionalism or like fake presuppositionalism or something, and this is someone who says, look, because we have knowledge, the best explanation for knowledge is that God exists. That's an argument that Thomas Aquinas or other folks could have been free to offer. What the presuppositionalist says is not just that that's the best explanation for knowledge, but that epistemically that's the starting place from which all knowledge must begin in order to be knowledge as such.
I think you go ahead.
And that's why. So otherwise, they wouldn't have to say that the atheist is in self-denial. See, if the person who uses the moral argument does not make the claim, doesn't have to make the claim that someone who recognizes the existence of morality is in self-denial. All they would have to say is that someone recognizes the fact of morality, but hasn't recognized what the explanation is of morality.
Right.
So actually, the reason why they have to say that non-Christians are in self-denial is because the only way to have knowledge is to first actually at some point recognize God's existence.
I think you're conflating two different things. They would recognize that they would say that I'm in denial, and they would recognize that I do in fact have knowledge. This is how we get to the whole borrowing from worldview. There's nothing about the presuppositionalist argument that I recognize where an individual's belief or acceptance that a God exists is in any way has any bearing on whether or not they can reason. God is the reason for reason, or God is the foundation for reliable reasoning, but belief in God is not the foundation. I mean, we've got subject disagreement, and as soon as you jump to belief in God, I don't see that you're talking about presupposition.
Well, so there is, if I may just, I think that there is a tension that's going on here, which maybe, I don't know whether this is right, but so we could at least clearly distinguish the idea that there's, the metaphysical foundation of these things like reasoning or whatever. That's one particular claim. And then on the other hand, there's this kind of epistemic claim, whether or not there's some additional claim that there's a foundation for knowledge or believing in something which Dan's been articulating. But I think that we can at least recognize some of that second epistemic claim in their reliance on the idea that Scripture is the final authority, right? And so it's, you know, when they say something, this is where there's that distinction between, you know, being an autonomous reasoner, being somehow kind of sinful, that you're thinking for yourself and trying to come to your own understanding about things, when in fact what you should do is just read what the Bible says. So if they say, and I think this is where the sort of circularity seems to be justified. Maybe it makes sense more if you take the epistemic line, at least, that when they say, well, look, I believe that the Bible is my final authority or something, and you say, well, why do you say that? And they say, well, because it tells me that it's my final authority. And you go, well, that's just like horribly circular. They would say, well, no, it's not. It's open. Maybe they'll say it's virtuously circular, although I don't think that there really is a proper distinction there. But if you're taking it as some kind of epistemic claim, then like I don't know, maybe that makes more sense of the idea that you take. It's not just that you're saying God is actually the ultimate metaphysical explanation for why, you know, the tides come in and go out, but it's also, I've got this book that's you know, in all questions, the thing that settles what the right or wrong answer is this book, that's this final authority, and that seems to be an epistemic claim rather than a metaphysical claim.
So something
right?
that's really instructive here is to read over the debate between. It's a written debate between Michael Martin, and I forget who the presuppositionalist is, but Martin at some point says that the presuppositionalist takes the, I guess it's really an exchange, because Martin published it in various places and the responses were published elsewhere, but at any rate...
Was it John Frame?
It might be. I'm not exactly sure who I don't remember exactly who the presuppositionalist was, but anyway, at some point in the debate, at some point in the exchange, rather, Martin says that the presuppositionalist takes a position rather like Descartes'. The response from the presuppositionalist is that, no, my position is nothing like Descartes, because Descartes begins with the cogito. Right. The Descartes begins with I think, therefore I am. And the presuppositional says, no, that's idolatrous. The thing that you instead need to do is to begin with recognition of the Christian scriptures and the Christian worldview and so on, and that's your epistemic starting point. And like I said before, Frame also has, I believe it's Frame that has a published paper where he lays out this view of epistemic aseity as an interpretation of Van Til. I think that's consistent with what Bahnsen says and the rest of these folks.
R.C. Sproul had a objection to that sort of view, where he said we don't start with the autonomy of the self, which he himself would be considered sinful, but we start with the consciousness of ourself, where we can't help to start with ourselves. So just like you mentioned, how can we start with God? How can we rely on God without recognizing ourselves first? So we have to start with the consciousness of ourselves, because that's the creatures we are. I can't reason with God's mind. I can't reason with your mind. I can only reason with my mind, even though God is responsible for creating my mind.
Right, and I guess, so here's where there is something like the distinction that Ozzy's been talking about, the externalist, internalist distinction. He's been talking about in the comments on the side of the...
Well, so maybe Ozzy should say something about that before we go into that.
Okay. Yeah, there is in epistemology a distinction called internalism and externalism with respect to justification. Justification, of course, is that which connects your belief to the object of your belief. So if I believe that this is a human hand in front of me, there's got to be something that connects my belief, the representation in my mind, that this is a human hand, with the fact that there's this human hand. Okay. Now, normally when you ask for a person for justification, you're asking them, give me something, tell me something, right, that will justify it, right? Ordinarily, when we ask for justification, we're asking for that the person satisfy some kind of internal task. That is, provide for me some experience, a memory or a perceptual state or something like that, that you have some first-person subjective mental experience that you're having, either right now or that you can summon to consciousness, that would justify your belief, that would connect your belief to the facts. That's an internalist conception of justification. The internalist conception of justification says that in order to know that a proposition is true, you have to be able to state the reasons. You have to be able to furnish the reasons, supply the reasons, give the reasons. They must be either a current, that is consciously available to you, or at least available to you in principle. They have to be summonable to consciousness. There's another competing conception of justification called externalism that says, no. You don't have to be aware of this and be able to supply the reasons. There just have to be reasons. You know that X is the case when X is true. You believe that X is true, and you are connected, causally or perhaps through some reliable process, to the fact that X. So that if your belief in that this is a human hand in front of you, if your belief that this is a human hand is the result of or occasioned by the fact that this is a human hand, if there's some kind of causal connection or some reliable process that connects the belief that this is a human hand with the fact that this is a human hand, then you know what you think you know. Okay, that's an externalist conception of justification, right? So your dog can know, for instance, that there's food in its dog dish, even though your dog doesn't know anything about optics and theories of vision and neurophysiology of the visual cortex or anything like that, right? Dogs don't practice any epistemology, but they know their master's voice, and they know when there's food in the dish and when there isn't. That's how they know when to eat out of the dish and when to look up at you plaintively because there's no dog food in the dish, right? So, depending on your conception of justification, this is going to shift whether or not something constitutes knowledge or not. Now, what's interesting about presuppositionalism is that it embraces what I think is the more sensible view of justification, which is the externalist conception of justification. The justification consists of being connected to the facts in some way, even if you're not necessarily in a position to supply those facts. You might not be aware of the justification, right? I mean, to have a justification and to be able to supply a justification are two different things. It's great to be able to supply a justification, but why do you have to be able to supply a justification to know? I mean, if knowledge is an objective state of affairs, then perhaps it's sufficient that you just be connected to the facts and then you know. It would just mean that in some cases you won't know that you know. You won't be able to satisfy what's sometimes called the KK principle, the know that you know principle. So what's interesting about presuppositionalism is that what they posit is that there is this God who serves as the guarantor of your beliefs. God, because he created the world a certain way with uniformities and regularities, and created you in a certain way such that you are a system with your mind and your brain that is capable of having experiences that systematically co-vary with changing states of affairs, that you are, your mind and brain is a reliable belief-forming engine. And so sometimes you're going to be wrong, but most of the time you're going to be right, and that this is no coincidence. And the idea is that you can know things because God created the world thus and so. He created you such that knowledge was possible. He could have created you with a mind that didn't work, right? He could have created us with a visual system that was right only 10% of the time. Only 10% of the time when you see an open doorway, is there an open doorway, He could have created us that way, but he didn't create us that way. He created us in a way that things are more reliable. So what's interesting about this is that according to presuppositionalists, we're supposed to be employing an externalist conception of justification. We can know things even when we can't give the justification because God created the world thus and so, right? If this metaphysical picture is true, then we know what we think we know. We might not be able, are not in a position to give reasons why we know what we know, but as long as this situation abides, as long as this situation obtains, right, causally speaking, then we know what we think we know. Now, what's interesting is that when you talk to most presuppositionalists, and they're playing this, how do you know that, how do you know that, could you be wrong about that, how would you justify that belief, they are insisting that you abide by an internalist conception of justification, that you be at every turn, whenever you say that you know something or think you know something, that you supply a reason, a justification. And then when you give that, they'll say, oh yeah, but how do you know that that justification is true? And then you have to give them another reason. How do you know this is a human hand? Oh, well, I can see it. How do you know you can trust your vision? Well, my vision has worked so well in the past. Well, how can you trust induction? How can you trust in the reliability of your memory, and so forth? And they keep asking you for justifications. And so you keep having to, go back and back and back. But what's interesting about that is that the presuppositionalist, when it comes to his or her own justification, always just insists that God is the guarantor of our beliefs. And if that circumstance obtains, if that is the situation we find ourselves in, then we can know things, because we are causally connected to the states of affairs that we believe in the right way. And that is all that's required for knowledge. But if you were to try to say that, well, listen, I think that there's I'm a naturalist, let's say, and I believe that there are these physical regularities, and I believe that evolution has seen to it that through the process of natural selection, that we have reliable belief-forming processes, and thus I am similarly causally connected to the facts. Right? If you try to trot out an externalist story, as they're doing, but one without God, right? They will say, no, that's no good. They will insist that you be able to supply the reasons in every instance. In other words, when you ask them to justify their beliefs about anything, about the world, they will ultimately say, well, there's this external set of circumstances, this metaphysical picture that I'm telling you about reality and how we're connected to the facts, that serves as the guarantor of my beliefs. But when you try to justify your beliefs, they insist on an internalist conception of justification. And so there's this double standard. They are insisting on an externalist conception of justification when it comes to their beliefs, and that you abide by the harder, stricter internalist condition on justification when they're asking you to justify your beliefs. And so this is a kind of a kind of bait and switch that goes on that I think most people don't realize, that they are in fact playing by a completely different epistemological standard than they're insisting you play by. And what's interesting is that most presuppositionalists that I've encountered don't recognize that there is this distinction, and don't even recognize that they are themselves supposed to be externalists. They seem not to be aware of this distinction. So I think a lot of them actually make this mistake quite innocently, but it is a mistake. So we do well to be aware of the fact that what they are doing is they are locating the source of their justification outside of their own awareness. It just has to be the case that there's this God who serves as the guarantor of our beliefs because he created the world a certain way. And if that is the case, then we can all know things, whether you're a believer or not, right? Because you find yourself objectively in this condition of being connected to the facts, which is why most presuppositions who know a little bit about this stuff will say, well, no, I'm not saying that you can't know. I'm just saying you are not in a position to warrant your knowledge claims, but you are in fact in a position to know things just like a dog can know things, just like I as a Christian or a Muslim can know things. And so that I think is an important thing to keep in mind, that they're not really saying that you can't know things. They're saying that you're not in a position you can't satisfy the conditions of public assertability that you know things. You're not warranted in claiming that you know things. That is a check that you cannot cash because the conceptual resources in your worldview are not there. You don't posit a God, therefore you can't posit this metaphysical state of affairs that would make knowledge possible. But I, as a presuppositionalist who believes in God, can cash that check. So we can both know things, theist and atheist alike, but only I am in a position to make sense of how knowledge is even possible and how you and I can know things.
Yeah, so I think
this is what I was talking about, in the sidebar about Descartes earlier. If I recall correctly, it was Hobbes who pointed out that Descartes' cogito is flawed in that it is contingent on the primacy of reason. That in order to even begin to reason that I think, therefore I am, you have to begin with the ability to reason. And I find it perhaps kind of funny because I'm not a philosophy professor, don't have credentials and degrees, and yet I was able to reason even before I have my current understanding, which is clearly not a complete understanding. I feel like I'm kind of summarizing Ozzy, so maybe I should move on, but the idea that one needs to believe or understand something is clearly demonstrably false, that I can reason. It's all about what reason do I have, or what cause do I have to believe that my reasoning is sound? And I think that for most of what we do, when it comes to epistemology, I'm pretty much with Susan, and I don't know if it's Hawk or Hack. I think it's Hawk, on foundherentism, which is this messy merge of foundationalism and coherentism, and I like the idea of potentially having some sort of external verification. But Hack, thank you. The thing that's appealing to me is that we kind of been going along. We know that there's something to justify, and we've argued forever about the different ways to go about justifying it, to go about, how do we know what we know? I mean, the whole foundations of epistemology. And I think it's clear that none of us currently, or perhaps ever, have a full understanding of this, and yet we're able to do it. And that's why I'm so attracted to consistency approaches, recognizing that they're not necessarily complete, because the test of any method for anything, science, epistemology, etc., is, does it consistently provide reliable results? Does my internal model of reality seem to match reality as best as possible? And while I recognize that maybe eventually we might gain some understanding that allows us to go beyond that and actually maybe get to capital T truth, I don't think we're there. And what I see from the presuppositionalists is they're beginning with capital T truth, this assertion of it. And they'll, do the various dance around about it. Well, God is the warrant for your ability to reason, etc. But back to what we'd said earlier, there's never any demonstration of this, and it may go down to things like incompleteness theorems and stuff that they may not be able to offer this foundation.
I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't ever go to Gödel. Why am I? I can just hear my voice doubling up for some reason.
Yeah, I'm not getting to math. I was mostly using it as kind of an analogous, but.
It's like the rule of Gödel's theorem on the internet is that it's never used appropriately. I mean, that Gödel's theorem isn't saying, I don't want to fall foul of this fallacy myself now, but it's essentially saying.
Rewind, and I never said that.
Yeah. Let's just leave Gödel out for the time being. I guess so. One thing I wanted to make sure that I said in this hangout was, so I think I would even go further than Ozzy had with. This idea that with the transcendental argument, let's state the transcendental argument as well. So it's true that Van Til doesn't say it, but Banson says it as something like the real way of proving that God exists is that if God didn't exist, it wouldn't be possible to prove anything, right? Which is a kind of compactified version of I think the following, which is that God is the necessary precondition for whatever you want, say reasoning, logic, or something. That's premise one. Premise two is that reasoning or logic or whatever it is possible, and therefore the conclusion must be that God exists, because God is the necessary precondition for that thing. That thing obtains. Therefore, you can kind of reason backwards from the thing obtaining to whatever's necessary for it to obtain also being the case. And that has the form of what philosophers call a transcendental argument. And it has God as its conclusion, and it uses all these fancy words that you hear presuppositionalists saying all the time, like the preconditions of intelligibility or whatever. So I think that it's safe to say that that's what the transcendental, I guess, what tag actually is. And I would go further than just saying that it's that what has to be established is two things: that A, it's the worldview, the Christian worldview or something, is coherent and therefore provides an account of whatever transcendental thingy it is that we're trying to account for, and that the interlocutor's worldview doesn't account for that. I mean, so say if I'm being pushed into some kind of atheist worldview, even if I do adopt that I'm an atheist and let's say I'm a materialist or whatever, blah blah blah, maybe I just lack the conceptual resources to be able to account for whatever transcendental thingy it is, and the other guy can, the Christian can. Even in that situation, nothing has been established yet, right? All that's been established is that somebody has at best a sufficient condition for the transcendental thingy that we're trying to account for. That, if Christianity were true, then it wouldn't be impossible, logic. That's all you've established. You haven't established that Christianity is true. So in order to do that, what you'd have to run through is not just atheism is false, Islam is false, Hinduism is false, and anything else I can think of is false, because all you're doing is racking up a kind of inductive argument that doesn't demonstrate that God exists. It just provides some support for it. So if you want a deductive argument that actually demonstrates that God exists, you would have to eliminate all other possible candidates. So it seems to me that you could even concede, for the sake of argument with a presuppositionalist, that your worldview is inconsistent and that their worldview is completely consistent. Grant them both of those premises, and it seems to me that still nothing has been achieved whatsoever. And there would have to be an actual reductio ad absurdum, where you say, if you want to argue for proposition P, and you use a reductio ad absurdum by saying, assume not P, and now derive a contradiction somehow from that, derive both Q and not Q from the hypothesis that not P, then that shows you that P is true. That's the form of a reductio ad absurdum, and it seems like that form of the argument fits well with the idea of the impossibility of the contrary. So that's the type of argument that we would need to see. It's no use just saying, I've refuted you, and I haven't been refuted. Therefore, I've established the conclusion that I'm going for.
That has a name. That has a name. That's a fallacy with a name.
Right. And the name of that fallacy.
It's the fallacy of arguing from ignorance, right? That you can't explain this. We don't know how X is the case. Therefore, Y is the case.
Right.
That's right.
Absolutely fallacious.
Often people talk about God of the gaps arguments, right? And usually a God of the gaps argument is where there's some gap in our scientific knowledge, and then people throw God in there as the explanation of some phenomenon. What's interesting about, or one of the things that's sort of interesting about presuppositionalism is that instead of being a God of the scientific gaps, it's a God of the philosophical gaps.
Right.
Here's this, right here are all these deep philosophical problems about skepticism and about the reliability of induction and so forth, and how we have these knowledge-generating capacities in the first place. Well, the presuppositionalist idea is just that we're going to throw God into that gap. I think this takes us to, so we talked a while ago about that we were going to say something about both my paper and other sorts of responses that each of us might have to presuppositionalism. And this might be a good place to start that off, because I've got this quote here in my paper from Bahnsen, from Greg Bahnsen, that backs up exactly the point that we discovered.
Go for it.
So here's what Bahnsen says. He says, all men have presuppositional commitments prior to their examination of various hypotheses. In the nature of the case, apologetics requires that we argue with the believer in terms of each other's most basic assumptions. We must challenge each other's final standards. This means that we must contest the grounds on which our opponent stands, showing that only within the context of the Christian worldview could we know anything at all. And so the idea that Bahnsen and other sophisticated presuppositionalists have is that what you're going to do is you're going to, given some interlocutor, you're going to show that their view can't possibly work, that it has various sorts of internal problems, and that in particular those internal problems lead them to some sort of radical skepticism, so that they can't even know that the external world exists, or that there are other people, or that science works, or that reason works, or whatever it is, that it leads to these kinds of radical forms of skepticism. But notice that this also suggests a way to respond to presuppositionalism, because he says that both him and his interlocutor, what everyone has to do is to go inside of the worldview of their opponent and then show that various problems come about as a result. So the suggestion from sophisticated presuppositionalists themselves is to do reductio arguments of each other's worldviews. And of course, the typical presuppositionalist line is that you can't do a reductio like that of Christianity, because Christianity is internally consistent and so forth, that it actually does explain our knowledge-generating capacities and does lay down the groundwork for the possibility of knowledge. what I try to do, well, myself and my co-authors, Jennifer Benjamin, and what we try to do in our paper is to demonstrate that, in fact, the particular kind of Christian theology endorsed by presuppositionalists, this kind of Calvinist Christian theology, that it also leads to radical skepticism, so that it can't actually explain our knowledge-generating capacities, and that we're left in a place where we have no choice but to rely upon the autonomous use of reason. And what we draw upon is the contemporary literature concerning what's called skeptical theism. So in the philosophy of religion literature, there's this guy named William Rowe, and he very famously wrote a paper arguing for what's called the evidential problem of evil, arguing that instances of suffering or pain that we see in the world are some sort of empirical evidence for God's non-existence. And the way he argues for this is he says, look, there's various instances of suffering and pain in the world that seem to have no explanation. And then Rowe says, well, look, if it seems to have no explanation, no explanation seems to be forthcoming, then what we should conclude is that most likely there is no explanation for those kinds of evil or those kinds of suffering or pain or whatever. The response from theists, not from presuppositionalist theists, but from other theists in the philosophy of religion literature, has been a position called skeptical theism, which attempts to block the inference from just because we can't see an explanation to the conclusion that there probably is no explanation. And the way that move works is by saying, look, human beings, we know very little about morality. Our past moral experience, moral history, shows that people are often very wrong about what is actually good or bad, and that it's quite plausible that our current moral knowledge is not representative of all of the moral facts that there are. And therefore, we would expect that something like a God would be able to see that various things that we think are right or wrong, or that make sort of intuitive sense to us to be right or wrong, that's sort of wrong-headed, that we're often going to be very mistaken. And so when we look around the world and we see things that we would think a perfectly good God wouldn't make, well, we're just going to be very often mistaken about that. And so on skeptical theism, evil and suffering and pain that we observe in the world are not going to be evidence for God's non-existence. Now, this links up to the presuppositionalist literature because the sophisticated presuppositionalists themselves have endorsed skeptical theism or something like it. So Greg Bahnsen says in various places that we have to begin with the assumption that God is perfectly good, and that it also tells us in Scripture, in places like Job, that God is infinitely mysterious. So those two claims together, that God is perfectly good and that God is often mysterious, together with, of course, the idea that our knowledge of good and evil is often clouded by sin and so forth, the conclusion is going to be something rather close to skeptical theism, if not skeptical theism, that we're just sort of lost when it comes to actually evaluating that question. We have to instead rely upon the presupposition that God is perfectly good, and then the conclusion is going to be that, well, whatever we observe in the world, whatever it is, has to be something that was created for perfectly good reasons, that God isn't going to be found morally bankrupt because of the things we find in the world. Now, the place where that leads you, though, is to say something like the following. Look, if it's not the case that we can actually judge what is good or bad, if we're as morally lost as Bahnsen and others say that we are, and we have to always assume that whatever God does is for the best of reasons, for perfectly good reasons, regardless of whatever God does, then we are no longer in a position to say that God wouldn't, for example, lie to us. Ordinarily, we would say that God wouldn't lie to us or God wouldn't deceive us because those are things that we typically think of as being good or bad. But notice that there are times when it might be good to lie. But at any rate, if God ever did lie, the presuppositionalist would simply turn around and say that that they were good lies, right? Just as God creates various instances of suffering or pain in the world, and what the presuppositionalist has to say is that those are for good reasons, that they don't reflect on any sort of moral wrongness on God's part. Likewise, if God were to ever lie or were to ever deceive us, then that again would have to be generated by perfectly good reasons. And the problem is we're not actually in a position to say whether or not God did ever lie to us or deceive us, and that moreover there's various points in Scripture where where God is said to have lied to various people, or to have deceived various people in various ways, or in which various beings, that various supernatural entities that God created, are deceive people in various sorts of ways. In fact, you can even find various places where, in John Calvin's exegesis of the Bible, Calvin just takes up exactly the position I've been describing, that God at times deceives people, has deceived prophets, for instance, and that even though this seems contrary to our understanding of goodness and badness, it's not contrary to God's understanding of goodness and badness to deceive human beings. And so part of what this means is that the presuppositionalist is left without the resources on their own view to say whether or not Scripture is truthful or veridical or whatever else. The kind of secondary line that I take in the paper is a position that I have borrowed from medieval philosophy. It's one that another YouTuber named, I think he goes by the name Epicurus on YouTube, but his real name is Edward Karam, and he points out that in medieval theology there was a position that was rather like presuppositionalism that already existed. It was called divine illuminationism. And according to divine illuminationism, the problems of radical skepticism raised by the ancient Greeks, could be resolved by appealing to God's illumination, that God would provide us with knowledge, God would illuminate us with knowledge, and that the kinds of skeptical worries that are created by human fallibility are solved by an appeal to God's knowledge-granting abilities. That because we have access to God, that's why we don't have to. That's why our fallibilities as human beings don't lead us to radical skepticism. That sounds a lot like presuppositionalism. But what John Duns Scotus points out is that if it's fallibility that creates these problems of radical skepticism, then it does nothing to add an infallible being to the mix. A fallible thing plus an infallible thing just gives you another fallible thing. The fact that God is infallible doesn't allow us to be any less fallible. We could, for instance, misunderstand the things that God reveals to us. In fact, that could explain why it is that there are so many internecine debates between Christians about how to interpret Scripture. Contrary to many fundamentalists, Scripture is not the sort of thing that is self-interpreting. At least not in the sense that everyone who reads it, even every presuppositionalist, is going to automatically agree about what it is that they read. The point of the matter is that we are left with our fallible natures, even if you throw an infallible thing into the mix. And if it's our fallible natures that creates the problems of radical skepticism, then we're going to be left with the problems of radical skepticism, even if you insert God into the picture. So this line that a lot of internet presuppositionalists take, where they say that, well, couldn't God reveal something to us such that we couldn't be mistaken? Well, this is already covered in medieval theology, and the answer is, well, God doesn't make a difference there. We could still be mistaken, no matter what God does, unless God makes us infallible. But God doesn't make us into other gods. We're still left with our finite, fallible human natures.
Okay, good. So you had two separate arguments there, and I think we've got people wanting to jump in. So Floyd,
Yeah.
did you want to come back on that point?
Yeah, just to expand on what you said, I use an argument against presuppositionalists to that very point where it says in Scripture that God can deceive people. He deceived the prophets, like you mentioned. He will put strong delusions on the people and so forth. So from that, I challenge the presuppositionalists. How do you know anything you read in the Bible is not a delusion, is not a deception from God?
Right.
If you appeal to Scripture, you're just begging the question, because that could be the very thing you're being deceived about. So it leads to what you're right, where a infallible being added to a fallible being still makes that fallible being fallible. So, and I think that's where a lot of presuppositionalists will argue, where their worldview can lead to knowledge while the atheistic worldview cannot, because they claim that in their worldview they have something that we don't. They have an infallible being, where in the atheistic worldview there is no such resource. So they believe that their worldview offers them a better epistemic viewpoint, where and this is where this is one of Eric Hovin's argument. Eric Hovin claims that to know something, you have to know everything, unless you know someone who knows everything, i.e., either God. So, but as you point out, is his God whispering in his ear every time he thinks he knows something? Like, if I see a computer in front of me, do I need God to whisper in my ear, yeah, that's really a computer in front of you? Oh, thanks, God. Well, if Christians as well as Eric would acknowledge, well, he's fallible. How does he know, as a fallible being, that voice whispering in his ear, so to speak, telling him what he knows is actually true? How does he know that is true itself? So, as you said, adding an infallible being into the mix really doesn't solve the problem at all. Another argument that Eric Hovin makes is he challenges you. He asks you, out of all the knowledge that you can know, all the potential knowledge you can know in the world, how much you as a fallible being, how much can you possibly know? And he'll grant you, being generous, perhaps you know 1% of all the knowledge that could be known, which could be considered to be generous. And then he challenges you and says, how do you know that the 99% of the knowledge that you don't know contradicts the 1% knowledge that you do know? Well, the problem with that is, if that 1% you actually do know is actually knowledge, is reliable, is true, then there's nothing in that 99% that will contradict it.
That's right.
And then, of course, at that point, he'll turn to internalism and say, well, how do you know that? 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 So it becomes the standard presup double standard at that point with internalism versus externalism.
Good, Ozzy. You had something that you wanted to bring in as well with that, I think.
Yeah, this business of an infallible God, and yet we are fallible beings. I mean, presuppositionalism, properly construed, doesn't posit that we get infallible knowledge. We get knowledge when you have knowledge under a definition of knowledge like justified true belief. You know things if you have a belief, and that belief is true, and it's justified in some way. And justification, according to presuppositionalism, is to be construed externally. That is, there's an external set of conditions, namely God and the way He created us and the world, that serves as the guarantor of our beliefs, that serves to justify our inferential practices and our cognitive processes and so forth. But I mean, that state of affairs, if it's true, if that metaphysical picture is true, then we can know the things that we think we know, but it doesn't make us infallible. And it's funny how many of these internet apologists who embrace presuppositionalism overreach. They don't realize that they don't have to have to claim infallibilism and certainty on any particular thing. They can be fallibilists. God didn't create us such that we're infallible. You don't have to claim certainty, but I think that they make such a fetish out of certainty because that is the weapon that they want to use against you. You can't know anything unless you can be certain. So they really want to cling to certainty. And then when you turn it on them, well, how do you know things? And they say, oh, well, it's been revealed to me in such a way that I can be certain. No clear-headed presuppositionalist, no serious presuppositionalist is going to embrace that. That I think is something that Seitan Rukenkate sort of spat out in a moment of panic when the tables were turned on him and he had to come up with something. And he said, well, it's been revealed to me in such a way that I can be certain. But it doesn't have to be revealed to you in such a way that you can be certain. It just has to be the case that there's a God who created you and the world in it such that you're fallible and such that you can have reliable belief-forming processes and practices that such that your beliefs arise as a result of the facts and not coincidentally, but not inerrantly. You don't need certainty. You don't need the impossibility of error in order to have the capacity for knowledge. But they overreach, I think the reason that they overreach and try to insist that they are certain about things that they're not in a position to be certain of as fallible beings, is because they have clung to certainty. They've glommed onto this concept of certainty as this blunt weapon that they can hammer over other people and say, well, you can't be certain. Couldn't you be wrong about that? Well, yeah, I could be wrong about that. Aha! Well, if you could be wrong about it, you couldn't possibly know something. But this is a case of them getting hoisted by their own petard, right? I actually heard a presuppositionalist in a hangout one time insist that he knows that God created cows, and are you certain about that? Yes, and he knows this because of God. And then of course it was pointed out to him, but God didn't create cows. We bred them, right, through animal husbandry. They're the descendant from wild aurochs, the species of cows that we have. God didn't create those. Those were not specially created by God. This is a human invention as a result of centuries of animal husbandry on another species that is now extinct, right? But this person was staking so much on his God. He's just, it's hard to parody this apologetic at times because people will, in their lust to pwn you and humiliate you with a difficult epistemological problem, they'll overreach and make claims that no clear-thinking, properly informed presuppositionalist would actually want to make, namely that they are in possession of certitudes.
Good.
That's right. That's right. And to be fair to my paper, so to develop the SCOTUS line against more sophisticated presuppositionalists takes a bit more than what I've said here. But I think the way in which I sort of couched the argument here does fly in the face of it does undermine internet presuppositionalism, and so. But yeah, and for the reasons we've discussed.
Okay, good. Matt, did you have something you wanted to jump in here?
I think Floyd wanted to add something really quickly.
Oh yeah, sure, go for it.
Yeah, some presuppositionalists assert that to have knowledge, it requires infallibility. That any fallibilistic epistemology cannot lead to knowledge, the Gordon Clark presuppositionalists, I believe that as well. This is the Clarkian scripturalists. They claim, real knowledge is knowledge that is truly infallible, and of course, God is infallible. So anything from God is infallible. So we know Scripture is infallible. So Scripture has true knowledge, and some will go to the length where, and it will surpass Van Til, where since we're fallen beings, since we are fallible, any knowledge claim, any truth claim, any belief we have is fallible, and thus it is just our opinion, where the only thing we can really count on is Scripture. So we can know, for example, that Jesus was resurrected because that was divinely revealed to us, but we cannot know that Barack Obama is the president of the United States because that just came from our subjective experience, which is fallible. It might be true that Obama is the president of the United States, but it's still just our opinion, where it can't be counted as actual knowledge. The only actual knowledge is revealed by God, because He is infallible. But it comes down to, well, it's the same problem we brought up before, where an infallible being added to a fallible being still gets you a fallible being. Us as a fallible beings, how do we know when we read Scripture? How do we know that when we're reading it correctly, or we're interpreting it correctly? We're still fallible beings trying to interpret Scripture. So even though Scripture may be infallible, we still have to process it in our fallen, fallible state. So I don't see how that gets them any farther.
Well, there's always the appeal to the Holy Spirit interpreting it for you, with that being infallible. I'm actually really happy with kind of how this discussion's gone, in part because when I was looking at the Facebook message from Alex, he made a statement, and I was kind of half awake. And he's like, but he said, have a think about how you would characterize your distinctive response to presuppositionalism. Take that however you want. And there was a part of me that thought maybe this was an intervention. Here's Matt's particular response to presuppositionalism, and we're going to explain to him where he's been screwed.
No, not at all.
Which actually would have been very welcome, and is something that Ozzy had largely already done. So that was kind of fun for me. And the reason that I worry about that is because we talk about how I've actually addressed this. The thing to remember is I'm doing a TV show, and when I do the debates, I'm not there to present an academic picture along with a lot of jargon. As a matter of fact, I tend to exploit when my opponents do that. Blake, I've done several debates with him. I'm going to do a couple more. He's a bright guy, but when he gets up to talk, he is often presenting what sounds like a book report and using jargon that might go over well in an academic paper and with a philosophy group, but isn't going to connect with the larger audience. So I'm the guy who essentially takes it all from a colloquial standpoint. I want people to understand what we're talking about, and that means that I'm going to get some stuff wrong and maybe not actually be accurate all the time. So when I debated Cy on this, because of corrections, because we know that certainty isn't a component of knowledge, even under the justified true belief definition or whatever view of knowledge you want, we've pretty much done away with the idea that certainty is or should ever be expected as a component of knowledge. But I actually went a step further, and it's because when we speak about knowledge, knowledge being a subset of belief, here's the things I believe, there's some subset of those that I claim to know. When somebody tells me they know something, my response is, I really don't care that you label it knowledge, because as Ozzy's pointed out, that is basically an expression of your confidence level. When most people talk about, I know this, what they mean is, I really, 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 really believe this. It would be worldview altering to discover that I'm wrong. So they're making a claim of some incredible confidence in the belief, not which tells you more about them than it does about the belief, and it doesn't get to anything as far as epistemic justification for it. It doesn't get to the arguments what is reasonable, and that's why during the debate, Cy was able to show this clip of me on the show in discussions about ultimate reality, where I said I really, 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 really don't care about this. And he's like, oh, Matt really, really, really doesn't care about ultimate reality. And the truth is, what I really, 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 really don't care about are unsubstantiated claims about ultimate reality. First, we need some mechanism demonstrated so that we can show that the thing that you're about to claim is the ultimate reality, that we have some good reason to believe that's the case. Because anybody can run around claiming that they have the tap directly to the source for ultimate reality. So that's the thing that I didn't really care about. Dan had mentioned something about when you combine something fallible and infallible, you're going to get or the fallibility is what's going to overtake it. And during the side debate, I actually used an example like this, and it's flawed. I know that it's flawed, of pouring clean water through a dirty filter. So if God is the pure source of knowledge and you're pouring it through a filter that's got, colored dust all over it, what you're going to get out is not pure water. And I was trying to use that as an example that anybody could get. That the claim that I can have perfect knowledge, or I can have confidence that my knowledge is perfect because it's coming to me from God, just ignores the fact that you've already acknowledged that you are a dirty filter. In many cases, even worse than a dirty filter. And we've done the same thing, not just with regard to reason and presuppositions, but I've used this with respect to morality as well. My favorite question to ask Christians in particular, but other versions of this apply to other theists, is how did you decide that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one? Because the general rule is that God has written his moral code on his heart. And my response is, well, if I wrote my moral code on your heart, you would then think I'm good. So this is it's a twist on the Euthyphro dilemma as it applies to morality, essentially. But it's something that resonates with some people. And when they start talking about the perfection of the Bible, or getting back to this idea of completely discrete, encapsulated worldviews, where Christianity has this whole worldview and I have this one and they don't overlap, I think, even though this doesn't really tie to presuppositionalism, my response about the Bible that I gave at a debate at a Church of Christ is probably my favorite, because I got up there on their podium and I said, essentially, you guys think that the Bible is this source of perfection, and yet I could write a book that's better than the Bible, and all of you would agree to that. And that's because you reject slavery. So I could rewrite the entire Bible word for word, reverse its position on slavery, and change nothing else. And we would have a book that's better because we have removed one fundamental flaw in the book. And when people start realizing this, it changes their perception of how they're going to look at the Bible. And I think while that doesn't apply specifically to presuppositionalism, it does with the filter thing. This idea that I have this perfect source. How did you determine that it's perfect? You're either assuming that it's perfect without any justification, which is how we get to presuppositionalism in one respect, or you have made reached some conclusion that it is in fact perfect. And if you are imperfect, you don't have the accuracy of measurement to be able to discern perfection, and so you must merely assume perfection. And I tend to try to expose the problems along those lines. The one exception, and I just raised this because it's out there as an episode of the show, Matt Slick had called in and we talked about his transcendental argument, which is, if you go to carm.org, you can actually see it. But what you're going to see there is not what was there when Matt and I had this discussion. And a lot of atheists that he talked to had pushed back on him with regard to his logical absolutes, which I'll put in scare quotes. And they had disagreed at a fairly early point in the argument because they wanted to make, a philosophical point, an epistemological point. And I let him just carry on because I had spotted another flaw, one that was, not going to send us off into a discussion about the foundational aspects of this, but just show that even if you were right about these other things, you are definitely wrong here. And he didn't quite get it. But what he did do, apart from creating the Dilahunty Dodge fallacy and claiming victory and all kinds of other crap, is he went and changed the web page in order to try to correct this problem that I had exposed. But because he didn't understand it, he actually made it worse. So while I haven't read the latest version at Carm, I do know that the version that was up immediately after our discussion was actually more flawed than the one that I had pointed to. And this is why when we talked earlier about, Van Til and these others, I disagree with the conclusions they reach, and I think that their arguments are flawed, and I think we can demonstrate that, and I think we largely have. But I don't see Van Til as I see Van Til as a thinker on these subjects who has a far greater understanding of the underlying subjects than any of the internet precepts that are running around basically parroting these ideas. And it's in part, I think they've all made the same mistake, including Van Til. They begin with the conclusion there is a God. Now let me find a way to justify it however I can. I think that's the foundation of all apologetics. I don't think anybody has ever been convinced that Jesus saves because of the transcendental argument for the existence of God. I don't think that William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument in any way leads you to Jesus. And I've talked before about how it's quite often disingenuous, the God they defend publicly versus the one they believe privately, but they're welcome to do that. And some of them do it for good reasons. But when we look at, the internet folks who are, oh, here's my presuppositional argument or my version of a presuppositional argument, they're not just like, maybe dilettantes isn't the right word. They're buffoons. I mean, they don't have the requisite understanding. And I would say that by and large, I probably don't have the requisite understanding, but I have enough to recognize that they don't either. And when we get to the fallacies or the problems with their arguments, my entire goal is, because I'm not a philosopher, I'm not in this for the academics, I'm in this to actually change people's minds. And so my only goal is to try to be as clear and understandable to anybody watching as I can. And while there may be subtle little errors that creep in, I mean, you're going to have that all the time. Anytime you argue by analogy, by definition, your analogy is not an exact match to what you're talking about. And so I like the fact that there's a lot of different approaches, and I also like the fact that I have access to, Dan and Ozzy and a bunch of other people who helped me see mistakes that I made. The biggest objection that people have raised, which maybe we can talk about another time, is that during the debate with Sai, I don't want to say I invented this because it's possible that it exists somewhere else, but I went with the concept of maximal certainty because I knew that he was coming from a standpoint of absolute certainty, and which I reject. And so the point was that the identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, the foundation that he's going to begin arguing from, those are my presuppositions, and my confidence level in them is maximal. I can't think of anything that I'm more confident in. I can't think of any way to rebut them without first assuming them. And while I can't use them necessarily to prove them, in a way we have done that, because this model, this sort of Venn diagram with a single circle that is defined by those, continually demonstrates its reliability and usefulness, and I have no examples where its reliability and usefulness are contradicted. So I came up with this idea, or I labeled it maximal certainty, and that anything that is deductively arrived from those positions would also be maximally certain, and anything that is inferential from that would be reasonable certain. And you might have different levels of confidence. How reasonably confident are we in this belief? And I did all of that in order to show that, number one, absolute certainty is a big fat red herring that nobody can get to. Number two, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. And number three, as we're going around about how to evaluate things, as soon as we start thinking in these absolutist terms, we're now talking about a completely different subject, because in daily life, all I need is a reasonable confidence that convinces me that the proposition I'm evaluating is true or likely true, and that's good enough, because I don't wait till I have knowledge to act. I don't wait till I have certainty to act. I act in accordance with whatever I accept to be true, even if I just barely accept it. And then you get into a better discussion about when belief A comes in conflict with belief B. Is it the confidence level that determines which one overrides? And I don't know, but that's a separate discussion.
So, I mean, I'd been thinking about this before with your way of defending, or I guess your particular response when I was thinking about what does that mean when I'm talking about Matt Dilahunty's response in that side debate. And there were moments where I was thinking, well, what he's done is kind of put forward I don't know whether an atheist presuppositionalist perspective or something. You're just like saying, well, it's fair enough you're having this. I mean, I don't know if this is just a tactic to respond to someone who's being a presuppositionalist, or whether it's an independently arrived at view. But I mean, it seems to me fairly unassailable if your opponent is saying, well, I'm a presuppositionalist and these are my presuppositions, and you say, well, all right, but I'm a presuppositionalist and these are my presuppositions, then it seems to me that unless, I mean, that's the perspective that the Van Tillian wants you to be in, and then he wants to be able to say, and I can derive contradictions from your set, and you can't derive contradictions from mine. I mean, at that point, I've been thinking recently that if that's the game that we're playing, there is some kind of I don't know what the word for it quite would be, but it's like it's taking stuff for granted that goes unsaid, right? Which is like this is the game that we should be playing, for instance, and that there are worldviews that each of us has, and all we can do is jump into each other's worldview and evaluate them on their own terms and see whether they come up to being consistent or not. But this is not really owning up to the fact that there are terms which are transcending the worldviews, like the notion of worldview, for instance, is something that you can't just say that on my worldview, your worldview isn't a worldview. Do you know what I mean? Like, we have to agree that there is some kind of stable concept of worldview that's accessible to both of us and isn't up for negotiation. And also this idea of like passing this test, this accounting for test or consistency or something. Maybe I say, look, on my worldview, it's consistent to say this thing that you think on your worldview is an inconsistency. But if that was the case, then the mechanism itself that decides which worldview is correct would be kind of worldview relative. And then the game just like stops making sense, I just think like, I just don't grant the rules of the game. Like, I mean, I certainly don't grant that those rules are more certain than the things you're asking me to call into question or justify, which is like principles of logic, the existence of the external world, the existence of other minds. I'm just more confident in that those things exist than that this kind of weird Van Tillian worldview testing game is even a worthwhile thing to do. So if it seems to me, then I'll shut up after saying this, but it seems to me that if someone asks you to play a game, conceptual game, where you're weighing these things up against each other, and part of the game means that you have to give up things that seem more reliable than the game itself, that's reason to reject the game. It's kind of like the a priori argument against just never talking to anyone who tries to get you to be a Van Tillian. So yeah, sorry, I'll shut up now.
So for clarity, just because you kind of raised this, this is not just a tactic. It's not just strategy. I'm legitimately presenting, what I think about these things. The reason why I think it's one of the reasons why I think it's particularly good is that it's not just, oh, here's my presupposition, so I'm going to reject yours, and here's my presupposition, which is why I'm going to reject yours. When I'm talking about presupposing the foundations of reason as a practical necessity and that they continually seem to reprove themselves, my opponents agree with me. What they're trying to do is find the foundation for what we both agree is true. And I'm saying, basically it's in Occam's razor use, that if we're both going to agree on identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, and the facts about them, what I don't see how we can go any further than that. I think this is as close to a foundation as you're ever going to find, and they're trying to go one step further back to say, but I have an explanation for the thing you're presupposing. And so my entire view is to say, you and I agree on the facts, and you are the one that's adding something to it, and you haven't offered any justification for why you're adding to it. So that's the only kind of strategy.
I mean, I'm kind of just tempted to say, to just quote Aristotle in the Metaphysics, where he says something like, if someone asks you to demonstrate that the law of non-contradiction is true, that just shows their lack of education, because they're just asking for something that can't be done.
I agree.
And to just dismiss it like that, like, just read Aristotle and you'd realize it was just a stupid thing to say. It's very patronizing.
That's my goal. My goal is to educate people. I don't think that that's going to educate people. I think who are confused about this will look at that as, oh, Matt just cited Aristotle. I still don't have any understanding of what it actually means. And all he really said was, well, you just don't understand. And so instead, which is why I can't ever give short answers as much as I'd like to, I end up giving a longer answer in the hopes that I explain the concept that you and I both already get, that you cannot demonstrate a problem with non-contradiction without first assuming it.
What I like about this, though, is that they would say, you just need to go and read your Bible. Well, and then Alex says,
but I've done that too.
You have to just go read your Aristotle, and and you'll see.
So Floyd, you wanted to jump in, I think, is that right?
Yeah. I mean, one thing we'll hear from presuppers is they'll say that, given our worldview, given the atheistic worldview, it leads to absurdity, where they claim that if they actually, given the presuppositions of atheism, it leads to an absurdity, where they claim, so they seem to be saying, okay, yeah, I'm going to perform an internal critique on your worldview and show where it's flawed, but they really don't do that. They really don't do that. What they do is an external critique. They actually attack our presuppositions. Do not take them for granted, and just show, well, your presuppositions are unfounded. Well, all presuppositions are unjustified and unfounded. So that's not an internal critique. They'll challenge you to do an internal critique of their worldview, accept their presuppositions, accept that their God exists, accept all the attributes they claim are attributed to their God, and try to find some internal inconsistency in there. But when it comes to our worldview, they don't do that. They're not willing to grant our presuppositions, and they simply challenge them. So that's another double standard they give.
This is the difference between the internet presuppositionalists and the sophisticated presuppositionalists.
Right.
So in Van Til's dissertation, which I have to confess, I have not read his dissertation. I've read secondary sources about it. And apparently what Van Til does in his dissertation is that he considers three worldviews. He considers Hegelian idealism, he considers pragmatism, and by which he probably means early pragmatism, not neo-pragmatism. And then he also considers what he takes to be the Christian worldview. And what he attempts to show is that the strengths of pragmatism and Hegelian idealism are preserved in Christian theism, but the weaknesses, all the problems in those views, are taken care of by Christian theism. So this is something that I think is peculiar to the internet variety, but doesn't appear in the more sophisticated folks who actually are going to do that kind of worldview analysis.
Yeah, and when you play the game of tag, I call it play the game of tag with a presupper. The game is to catch the other person in a contradiction. So the contest is who's more rational here, and you even see great debate topics called what worldview is more rational, Christianity or atheism, and again the rules of the game here is catch the other person in a contradiction, but the avenue they take is just say, well, you can't account for your presuppositions, you can't account for your properly basic beliefs. Where I can account for a mind-independent reality, I can account for other minds existing and my use of induction and so forth. I'm just going to appeal to my ontology, and that's it. But you atheists, I'm not going to let you appeal to your ontology. You're going to have to justify your epistemology with your epistemology, which is circular, and that's another double standard that the presuppers play. To account for anything they want to account for, mind-independent reality, other minds existing, the valid nature of deduction and so forth, they'll simply appeal to their God, saying, oh, it's part of God's nature. So it's just a part of their ontology. But they're not willing to grant the same for us. So again, it's another double standard that they play.
You mentioned this on the probability on atheism. I actually come across this a lot more often, and it's been pretty useful to point out that first of all, they'll do a probability on naturalism and probability on supernaturalism, or the probability of this proposition if there was a God versus probability that there's not. And while I also point out that atheism isn't necessarily an assertion that there isn't a God, but a rejection of the proposition that there is, although there are other uses, there's a lot of people that are trying to jump all over this Bayes theorem bandwagon to demonstrate that, based on what we see in the world, we can conclude that it's highly improbable if there wasn't a God, so therefore we're reasonable in assuming or accepting that there is. And this is such a gross misuse of Bayes' theorem, because I don't know what kind of priors you can have to establish the probability that a God exists or the supernatural exists. First you'd have to show the supernatural exists, then you'd have to show that it can in fact interact with reality, and then maybe you could make a case based on the number of times you've demonstrated it that it is the better explanation for this particular.
Here I want to say two things. The first is that this is evidentialist apologetics, which sort of gets us away from what we were talking about in the podcast. But
this is where they go. This is once the precept gets defeated, this is where they've gone, at least with me.
Sure, it's interesting they do that because, of course, Van Til would consider that to be a kind of idolatry. That would be the use of autonomous reason to establish God's existence. And on Van Til's view, that could never establish the actual Christian God's existence. It would just establish the existence of a false idol or something like this. But the way that you set up that problem, the comparison of two probabilities, you don't actually need priors. You can set up a comparison of what are called likelihoods without using priors. What you're then doing is you're asking the question, what is the probability of, say, moral facts given theism versus the probability of moral facts given atheism? There are other problems estimating those probabilities, but the problem is not an estimation of priors, because in a comparison of likelihoods, you don't actually have to use priors. You don't have to use Bayes' theorems.
This is where it loses me every time, because as soon as you mention the word probability, you're presuming some sort of calculation, and I have no idea what justification you could have for any calculation about the supernatural.
Well, yeah. So the question is this: does the hypothesis in question, whether a naturalistic hypothesis or a supernaturalistic hypothesis, predict the phenomena that you're observing? That's the question. That's what the.
If I say what is the probability on the proposition that there are transcendent pixies who have a desire and ability to form a moral framework, that we would have a moral framework. This idea of constructing a proposed explanation, which is
that you can't do,
sufficient
right?
But not necessary.
Well, but see, the thing is, the way that you just set up the probabilities, it's not something that I would know how to do. But you can ask a different sort of question. You ask the question like, suppose that one hypothesis is that there are fairies that generate, I forget what the phenomena was that you named, but whatever phenomena you'd like. Maybe the reason why my cat is meowing right now is because there's like fairies in the part of the room that I can't see right now. Maybe that's the hypothesis. And so you can ask this question. You can ask, what is the probability that my cat is meowing, given that there are pixies that are generating her meowing? And actually, the probability of that is 1.
Yeah, that's the point. This is what I see when they start saying, what is the probability that a universe would exist given the proposition that there's a God who's capable and has a desire to create the universe? Well, you're of course going to get a 1 out of that. And my concern isn't that, and it doesn't, to say that it's less likely on atheism doesn't tell me anything about the actual state of affairs.
So
and
the problem here,
like Bayes' theorem being used to justify almost anything.
That's right. So the problem is that when you compare likelihoods, you need more than just whether or not the hypothesis predicts the phenomena in question. See, the hypotheses that we just generated, your God hypothesis or the magic pixies that are generating the cat meowing hypothesis, those are they're rigged hypotheses. They're rigged in such a way that they deductively entail the phenomena in question. You need more than just that the hypothesis generates the phenomena. There's a whole host of different kinds of epistemic norms that need to be employed. Now, more sophisticated evidentialists like Robin Collins are actually aware of this, and there's a debate in the philosophy of religion literature where people try to supply what these other conditions are on hypotheses they have to satisfy. So there's a very famous, I don't know if it's really famous, but there's a paper that is a rather important paper that Robin Collins wrote I believe it's in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology that William Lane Craig edited, where he tries to supply the what these extra conditions are going to be. And then there's other folks like Elliot Sober who have argued that the fine-tuning, for instance, does not actually satisfy these extra conditions. And so there's a debate going back and forth about what exactly those extra conditions are going to be. I think that the point that we brought up in popular debates with theists is just this point that no one can agree on what these extra conditions are, and that moreover, most of the time when you see Christians appeal to these kinds of things, they don't even appeal to those extra conditions at all. So if you look at a lot of the debates that Max Andrews has participated in, for example, I had 2 debates with him. I don't think my performance was all that great in either of them, but if you go back and view those debates and you look at what Max's arguments are, he tries to pull off this likelihood stuff, but then can't back up with the extra, can't supply the extra conditions, and that's what Justin Schieber, when he had his debate with Max Andrews, pressed Max on, was just to challenge him. Look, like, what are your extra conditions here? I mean, it's sort of comical in a way because Max quotes the paper, the Robin Collins paper, but then doesn't bother to bring up the rest of the paper where Collins supplies what Collins thinks these extra conditions are supposed to be.
Yeah. I think we're going to we should probably do another panel where we get beyond presup and talk about other argumentation forms. But...
That's right. I think that would be good. But I think I want to... So Alex, do you want to move on and talk about your responses to Matt Slick?
You're muted, Alex.
Okay, good, thanks. So, while I would like to do that, obviously, I think that as we're reaching, or maybe even exceeded the 2-hour mark, it might be good to just sort of call this particular session to a close now, as we seem to have reached kind of stopping point. I mean, I need to eat some food and stuff. You know, I'm in a different time zone to the rest of you guys. So maybe we'll just sort of informally say now at this point that we'll just like call it a day and reconvene at a later date, if that's all right with you guys. Unless there's anything like if someone wants to, really needs to get off their chest right now, this is the time to do it. No, okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, yeah. So it's been fun, and yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, guys.
Absolutely.
We'll call it a day now.
Yeah, thanks for having me.